right now. But yeah, I grew up west of Milwaukee, about 30 miles in Waukesha County, if anybody knows that area. Uh, and Actually, we were a very homogenous kind of place. I mean, I didn't even have any friends of color that I can think of growing up. But I do have to credit my family with teaching us the values that come with Catholic faith, and they were very insistent on the equal dignity of every person, that we were all created in the image of God. Um, and I remember one of the only Black people I ever met growing up uh, was an RN. He had taken care of my great grandfather in his declining years, and my father had kept a relationship with him. And a couple of times when I was a little kid, he came out to the house, and we were just fascinated by him. And he was such a nice man too. Um, but I think, first of all, just being raised in the faith, is you're constantly renewed in your awareness that God is the creator, and that everything that he made is good, and you come to an awareness that different cultures are such a gift, such a blessing, and so fascinating. I guess as I look back, I have to think the major part of this is just that my own understanding, although I can't say I'm, the journey is done, but to the degree that I've recognized the tremendous gifts that people of other races and cultures bring, it's a gift of grace. But and of my upbringing to some degree, and of my early fascination with just different groups of people, different languages, different ways of living, and so on. So when I was a kid, very early on, I thought about being a priest. I might want to do that. Actually, there were three competing possibilities when I was a little kid. I won't tell you the full story in the interest of time, but I can still remember when I was 8 years old thinking about what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I thought I'd really want to be a fireman. That'd be really cool to be a fireman. Oh, exciting. Or I'd like to be a doctor. I could heal people, make them feel better. Or I might like to be a priest, and that way I could help them to be happy and to live forever. So I thought about all three of those things. And then as that idea was in the back of my head. It certainly wasn't in the front most of the time. A lot of my growing up years, I was a lot more interested in playing football with the neighborhood kids, and baseball, and whatever sport was in season. All kinds of things that kids do. But in those moments, I did think about what I would want to do as a priest. I was attracted to being a missionary. I heard the stories of all these missionaries that went to places where the gospel hadn't been heard, and where the life is so different, and so on. I thought that would be so cool. But as I got a little older, there was a competing idea about being a priest, and that was to be a parish priest, just like my country pastor. And that's the one that basically won out. But when it was time for me after high school, when I thought, I probably need to try this out in the seminary and find out for sure if this is what God wants me to be. I didn't go the traditional course. I didn't contact my diocesan vocation director and ask to study for my home archdiocese, Milwaukee. Instead, I just kind of freelanced it. I looked around the country for a good Catholic college, a good seminary, and I found this place in Dallas. And I thought, if they'll take me, I'll go there for a couple of years and work my way back home. But I ended up in a few years saying, I've really come to love the church here. It's young, it's growing. I was so enamored of the Hispanic population, their faith, the way they lived it, their sense of family, community. I ended up signing up for the Diocese of Dallas. So my ministry from then on was always in communities that had a minority of Spanish-speaking people, of Hispanic people. And I saw it as one of my callings and in a certain way, one of my gifts to build bridges. I always saw myself as a bridge builder between the different communities. And I loved doing that. It was hard, really hard work, because the people who had already been there said, hey, this is our parish, okay, we'll let them use our hall, something like that, we'll let them have a mass time at, 2 p.m. in the afternoon when the Cowboys are playing. We don't want to go mass there then anyway, so it was my challenge to try and bring together these communities. It just didn't seem right to me that the church should be a place where we just kind of out of the kindness of our heart, let this minority community use our place, and that's it. That just doesn't make sense in terms of the work of communion that God is calling us to. So that was my challenge, and it seemed like every place I went to, the first parish I went to, the bishop said, I'm sending you to this parish, newly ordained priest, right? You're going to be the assistant there, and I want you to start the first Spanish Mass in this parish. And I said, oh boy, now I really have to learn Spanish. I had just gotten enough to get by in college, barely. So I went there and, I started talking about the fact the bishop wanted a Spanish Mass, and the people said, well, that's all very nice, Father, but we don't have any Spanish-speaking people here. Basic thought is we don't need a Spanish Mass. And I said, well, the bishop said, that I've learned that that's really handy sometimes, the bishop said. And so we started the Spanish Mass. The people were so patient because my Spanish was terrible. But we struggle along. People help me translate my homilies, things like that. And it wasn't any time at all before the church was full on Sunday. And today they celebrate about, I think they're close to 11 masses in that parish on a Sunday, and 9 of them are in Spanish. So it turned out there was a need. And it just kind of went from there. So then I had a chance for some mission opportunities, and it's like God has given me everything I dreamed of. I became a parish priest and a missionary. I was working with immigrants early on, and then in the first parish I served as a pastor, we created a sister parish situation in Mexico, and we were going down 3 times a year with different groups, youth groups, adult construction groups, religious education groups, and it just brought a dynamism to our parish, and it turned out to be the best way I think I ever came up with, well, ties with maybe one other idea, to unite the community, because when we went to Mexico, suddenly these people that were on the outside in our community, the Spanish speakers, became worth their weight in gold, you know, to communicate with the people in our sister parish. And they became the leaders of our mission trip. So it was just a great experience. At a later parish, we had a mission, a sister parish in Honduras. I had the chance during a sabbatical to go down there and spend a little more than 2 months working and living in a parish. I always wanted to understand where our people were coming from and what their faith was like and why they left. So that was a rich experience that resulted in future relationships with Honduras. So,
Bishop, I'm going to do a dangerous thing and cut you off so that I can introduce Marisa, and then we're going to shift a little bit more towards some of your work in El Paso. So Marisa, would you mind telling us just a little bit more about your background and your work with Hope Border?
Absolutely, Bishop, your stories are fascinating. I really want to learn more about your origin story.
All evening.
Yes, so my name is Marisa Limón Garza. I'm Deputy Director with the Hope Border Institute. We are based here in El Paso, Texas, which is at the farthest western tip of Texas, near Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. And our work is really that of a social justice organization deeply rooted in Catholic social teaching. And so our work is more of the long game of justice. It's the policy work, it's original borderlands-based research, and it's also looking at parish leadership formation. And so we are very fortunate that we get to work closely with Bishop Seitz and all the good folks of the Diocese of El Paso, as long as with the Diocese of Juarez and that of Las Cruces, New Mexico. So we are at an interesting intersection at a particularly poignant moment in time, and we take that position and that role very seriously. And so I'm thrilled to be with you all this evening. Thank you for hosting us, all of the parishes that are engaged in this effort. Thank you for taking on these heavy topics. They're certainly not easy, but they're imperative components of our faith, and it's how we are able to profess that and to live that out more wholly.
Thank you. And we have to ask the question we ask of all of our Notre Dame alums, which is, which house were you in?
Yes, I lived in Lewis, so behind the dome, far away, but it was a great time. I continue to serve on the Hispanic Alumni of Notre Dame, and so unfortunately our fall meetings got canceled, but we'll be back on campus as soon as possible.
Wonderful, thank you. So Marisa used the word imperative. Bishop, you open your 2019 pastoral letter, Night Will Be No More, which I encourage everyone to read. It's truly prophetic and profound, by saying, on August 3rd, 2019, El Paso was the scene of a massacre or matanza that left 22 dead, injured dozens, and traumatized the binational community. Hate visited our community, and Latino blood was spilled in sacrifice to the false god of white supremacy. You go on to assess that words like racism and white supremacy make us uncomfortable and anxious, and I don't use these labels lightly. We live in a brutally unforgiving culture where these words are tossed about like weapons, but perhaps we are also aware that these conversations may require changes to the way we think and live. And I want to emphasize this. You say, challenging racism and white supremacy, whether in our hearts or in society, is a Christian imperative. And the cost of not facing these issues head on weighs much more heavily on those who live the reality of discrimination. To hear a bishop use the phrase white supremacy with such candor is remarkable, but to hear you state unequivocally that challenging white supremacy is a Christian imperative, that's really extraordinary. So in your understanding, could you tell us more about why you think combating white supremacy is a Christian imperative?
It's a Christian imperative because white supremacy is not a Christian notion. It's foreign to our faith. A quote that I also drawn in this letter is from Archbishop Chaput, who just retired as Archbishop of Philadelphia, and he calls racism the ugly original sin of our country. And I think he characterized it well like that. You know, what's more fundamental than to say that we human beings have the same Father, you know, who is God, the same Creator, who loves us so completely and unconditionally, and it's in us. It's not just a, I have a friend who always says that God loves everybody, but he loves me best. Yeah, well, nice thought, but I think he knows that God loves, like any good parent, he loves each of us in our own beautiful uniqueness. That's fundamental Christian teaching. And the problem with white supremacy, of course, is that it's not put under the light of Christian faith often enough. It's too often it's an unconscious way of thinking or acting, and it's not something that we reflect upon in terms of our faith, because we've compartmentalized our faith to such a high degree that the light of the gospel doesn't shine in the midst of our world.
Thank you. So Marisa, next question for you. In his pastoral letter, Bishop Seitz observes that the Matanza in El Paso focused our attention on the grave racism directed at Latinos today, which has reached a dangerous fever pitch. Latinos now tell me that for the first time in their lives, they feel unsafe, even in El Paso. They feel that they have targets on their backs because of their skin color and language. What have you heard firsthand in your work from Latinos in the community about their experiences of fear and violence?
Sorry about that. So to give you all some context, just like Bishop Seitz was mentioning that he grew up in a homogenous community, I was born and raised here in El Paso, which is also a homogenous community. It just happens to be more Latinx and specifically Mexican. We're neighbors with literally stone's throw away from another country. And it's a very unique space and place. And this attack, again, for further context for folks, there sadly have been so many mass shootings in this country that we can become numb and we can expect another one to happen with relative frequency. And so when this attack happened on August 3rd, it wasn't just another mass tragedy in that sense. It was very specifically rooted in the rhetoric of the president. Rhetoric that from his candidacy and his running had to do with really othering and using very hateful words against Mexican people, specifically people of color altogether, and large swaths of the American public. And so that really caused trauma and a lot of irrevocable harm. El Paso is a place that has enjoyed many years of relative peace, relative little violence, that can be juxtaposed with our sister city of Ciudad Juarez that has endured many difficulties and lots of challenges. However, this was when a lot of violence that is recognized in other places came home to roost, and it came to our community, it came to our backyard, it came to a Walmart on a Saturday morning when people were grocery shopping, when soccer teams were raising money for their sports club, where parents were buying back to school clothes for their kids, where people had come from Mexico, because this is what folks do. You get on a bus and you come across for the day to do your grocery shopping, and you go back, and they never got to go home. So 23 people were killed. Families have been, lives have been shattered, and our perception of ourselves as a community has forever changed. And we're still wrestling with what it means to be in this community, because it's not like it happens in isolation. Our community has been targeted for so many different reasons throughout this administration, particularly with how we've welcomed the migrant and how we've engaged with people. And so you can ask everyday El Pasoans, and they are nervous about going into a Walmart, going into a grocery store. It was a stark difference of the before and after. And even though we're in a COVID-19 world and the pandemic has turned everything upside down, folks are still wrestling with what it means to be, to have that target on your back. And I don't think that feeling has gone away. I think it's still present.
Can't imagine. I mean, literally can't imagine. As a follow-up to that, so you mentioned the pandemic, which obviously has had its own, accelerants on some of the justice issues being faced. But can you say a little bit more about also the combination of the pandemic and the Remain in Mexico policy and the invocation of Title 42, which Bishop Seitz mentioned? For those who didn't see, he has an op-ed in the Dallas Morning News this week calling on action around immigration, saying that basically asylum at the border has been effectively ended entirely. Our long legacy, decades of since World War II, of admitting refugees has effectively been shut down by the administration in the moment of a pandemic. What has that done, Marisa?
It's been incredibly challenging. El Paso and the bishop himself, like, I cannot give you enough kudos, Bishop, for opening up literally your home. So we office when we officed in an office at the Diocese of El Paso campus. And in the seminary building next door to it, there's a large hall that had been used for a variety of events and trainings and teachings. When the bishop got the call that Annunciation House, our refugee shelter provider here locally who does tremendous work, when they said we need more space because we have more and more people, the bishop literally opened his house. And an emergency shelter operated for, I believe, close to 9 months, 24/7. We celebrated posadas, we celebrated Christmas, we celebrated all different kinds of things. And all of that ceased when Remain in Mexico came, right? All of the actions that we were doing as a community, and Chicago as a receiving community received so many of those folks that were finding home and relocation. Your community has done tremendous work when it comes to walking with people through their immigration court proceedings. And a lot of that is desperately needed. And sadly, with Remain in Mexico, that's all stopped. The border has become much more hard. People have to wait in Ciudad Juarez. And on top of that, adding a pandemic. So just like in any other close quarters, we know that all the best medical guidance is that you need to distance yourself. And that's impossible in many ways, whether that's in the prisons in the US, whether that's in our detention centers, or whether that's in migrant shelters south of the border. And so all of this pandemic has been used as pretext to push more of this agenda. We know that Election Day is 17 weeks away. And as we get closer and closer to that date, we, Latinx community, El Pasoans, people at the southern border, understand that we will be continually kind of targeted because we're fodder for the base that the president wants to uplift. And so we kind of brace ourselves for more is to come, because you got to keep ratcheting up those levels of anti-immigrant rhetoric, that racism and xenophobia, even though we know that strategy is kind of not working anymore because the polls are showing different things, but we're aware of that. And so we're mindful of that. So it's very important for clergy, for people of faith, to take a stance like Bishop has done with the op-ed in the Dallas Morning News, with the statement related to Title 42 and the disastrous outcomes that is wreaking on our communities, on people just like us, who are just trying to seek asylum, the legal, internationally recognized right to seek asylum.
Thank you. And for those who are interested, at the end of this, we will have some links and to share about anyone who'd like to support the work of Annunciation House, or who'd like to find out more about how you can do remote data entry to help support people that are applying for asylum. So we will provide some of that. Bishop Seitz, one of the things that Marisa just mentioned was the role of clergy and yourself in speaking out, for which we're very grateful. We're so grateful for you taking this time tonight. But in your pastoral letter, you weave in a great deal of history that I hope people will take the time to read about how, alongside what we were taught growing up, certainly myself, even in Catholic school in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, was the age of exploration, the explorers, and the people that headed westward. And you name some of the racist ideology and very, very harmful action that the church did not speak out against, and in fact sometimes participated in as part of Manifest Destiny, as part of enslavement of indigenous and African individuals. And you say, I'm going to quote you here, "We often took the European experience of Christianity to be normative and failed to appreciate the ways that God was already at work and still at work today in indigenous peoples and cultures. We perpetuated damaging notions of power and the desire to dominate, and so contributed to the exploitation of peoples and the environment." This is one of the things I think many Catholics, especially white Catholics, struggle with, is the church's role in helping support systemic white supremacy and racism. How do you understand the role the church has played in helping construct it, and some of the work we need to do as a church to deconstruct it?
The church is a complex reality. It is a place where we find the inbreaking of God's kingdom. And at the same time, it's a place deeply human, and because a human, deeply broken. So, the church has always taught about incarnation, and has also talked about original sin. As I mentioned it before, that sin has broken us and broken into our world, and that's the world that Jesus broke into. And in creating the church, he didn't create, as we say, a hotel for saints. Eventually we hope it will be that, but he created a hospital for sinners, right? And so that is the church. The church is a broken place that too often reflects the fallenness of human beings, too often reflects the secular understandings and realities, too often fails to do what I was talking about earlier, to bring the light of the gospel to bear on the present reality. But that should really, while we don't accept that and say, well, that's just okay because, that's the way we are. At the same time, we have to recognize that is indeed what Jesus put together. I mean, he didn't have to come, and he didn't have to make, he didn't have to save us through human beings. It could have been so much neater if God had just plucked us out of this reality somehow. But then we would not have been able to have the great dignity that is involved in being participants in a certain way in God's work of redemption, and that's something that's deeply Catholic, I might say. We don't see our Savior as just out there doing something for us and then saying, okay, guys, come on in, but we see him entering into our life and walking with us and calling us and challenging us and converting us and forgiving us and moving us forward. Look back to the church in any age, from the very beginning, those first 12 that Jesus chose until the present moment. You'll not find any age in which there is not those elements that need to be redeemed. But you will also, in the midst of that, and sometimes at the darkest moments, find seeds of grace. Seeds of grace present and working in the midst of the church. That's why I love her.
Thank you, Bishop. So Marisa, Bishop Seitz has just told us we're incarnational. Christ has no hands and feet but ours. And so, he says in his pastoral letter, as builders of the temple of justice here in the Americas, it is not enough to be not racist. Our reaction cannot be non-engagement. We must also make a commitment to be anti-racists in active solidarity with the suffering and excluded. And in the following paragraph, he says what that would look like, which would be, we must work to ensure all children have access to quality educational opportunities, eliminate inequality in the colonias, pass immigration reform, eradicate discrimination, guarantee universal access to health care, ensure the protection of all human life, end the scourge of gun violence, improve wages on both sides of the border, offer just and sustainable development opportunities, defend the environment, and honor the dignity of every person. So as part of our work for being incarnational and hands and feet and anti-racist, the bishop has said how we're called to work for universal access to healthcare, however that looks, universal access to quality education, universal access to a living wage. How is Hope Border and how are other communities that you see working to advocate for precisely those just policies, and how can we support them as a church?
So it's a laundry list, right, of things we've got to do. And luckily we have many people able and capable to do this work. But where it begins, even before with organizations and groups, it begins within each one of us. It begins with the quiet contemplation and prayer. And it begins with questioning our own assumptions and biases and how we got here. And for many of us, it includes questioning much of which we've been taught, much of which we've come to accept as our own personal norms and realities and our own views of the world, because those may not be held by everyone. And even though we're all part of the same community, the same country, the same cities, our experiences can be vastly different. So whether you're at St. Clement's or if you're in the south side of Chicago, you're still in Chicago, but is that the same lived reality? And so organizations like Hope are specifically taking action through a very dedicated and defined anti-racist approach. So when August 3rd happened, and it burst that bubble for our community of peace and feeling safe, and now all of these things were called into question, it made us rethink, what do we do with this? What is our role? What is our work? How do we respond? And so we took the anti-racist message that's in the pastoral letter to heart. And we've looked at all of the work that we were already doing, whether it was related to immigration, whether it was related to leadership, whatever spaces we were doing work, and looked at it specifically through an anti-racist lens. So pulling apart every piece of business as usual and casting that light on it and continuing to do that. So thinking about ways that we could do that even from our own organization. So just last week, having a conversation with Dylan Corbett, our director, about some readings that I'd done on how white supremacy particularly shows up in nonprofit organizations. And going through and analyzing and asking these questions and having the conversation, things that we technically wouldn't have to do, like no one would be the wiser if we did this or not, but knowing that it's core and it's fundamental, and seeing our own incarnation, our own faith alive in other movements. So the movement for Black Lives is not something ancillary or something that's happening over there. Instead, it's aligned with our own, because we see the human dignity inherent of all people. And when there's oppression of any group, we're all suffering for that same kind of oppression and having it spill out in other ways. And so it requires organizations to take that deeper look. It requires us to question everything that we've come to know. And there's an opportunity, especially for people that have some kind of influence or some kind of leadership role, to look at whatever domain that is and think about, how is this work serving certain people? How is it maybe acting as a disservice to others? And how can I be an active interrupter, as uncomfortable as that may be, to make sure that people's voices are heard, that we have an equitable participation, that everyone can flourish and be part of this abundance that we know exists versus these threats of fear and of scarcity.
Thank you. So one more question for Bishop Seitz, and then what we're going to do is we're going to turn it into a Q&A. And so for those who are on the Zoom session, if you have a question for Bishop or for Marisa, you can submit it to me in the chat box, and we'll try and work our way through those questions. And we're going to plan to end at 8:30 Central Time. So final question for you, Bishop Seitz. You know, our Catholic sacramental theology insists that conversion and reconciliation are possible. And right now, many of us, I think nationally, individually, communally, are engaged in a sort of examination of conscience about our own complicity in this social sin of racism. And so once we've taken an honest accounting through this examination of conscience, the next step, right, is confession. We have to name honestly our role in this sin, accompanied by contrition, you know, a real detesting of the way that we have been part of dehumanizing or subhumanizing certain others. And so my final question is, what do you think it would be for us to undertake penance in this moment? How can we begin? Because penance is a necessary part for eventual absolution and metanoia. We're starting to name these sins. We're starting to confess complicity. What can we be doing in terms of beginning this process of atonement?
Well, I think I want to be very careful not to pass over essential steps, just to jump over some early recognition to penance, because I think we could find ourselves at the what we would consider the end of the journey without having walked, and so the place I see myself right now, and I think that our society is at a point where we need to do a whole lot of listening without suggesting that somehow, oh yeah, I've got the answers. That's such an American thing, right? You know, we'll come in and fix it. You know, this situation is not going to fix itself, and we're not going to fix it. Part of the, one of the most profound aspects of white supremacy is that it silences the voices of others. They're unseen, unheard, like that example I gave you in Garland. Well, Father, we don't even have anybody here like that. Well, we've got to start noticing, and we've got to start listening without having the answer running, you know. And if you want to seek penance, then make that your penance to start out, you know. Take the time, make the effort to truly listen, to read, but perhaps even more importantly, to, you know, to talk to your friends. One thing that came out in a number of instances, both in the August 3rd shooting here in El Paso, and then after George Floyd's killing, and I think every time there's one of these racist acts, we have a special opportunity, but people of color, they live this every day, you know, and they know the stories, they know what they've been through, but they don't talk about it to their white friends, you know. They don't write about it. It's just like, I don't know if part of it is they don't want, you know, people to feel sorry for them or whatever, you know. And I'll tell you what I think the major thing is, because talking to our Native Americans here in El Paso was a real revelation. Part of it is that I've discovered that the natural human tendency is just to bury it, you know, just to say, this is too painful, I'm not going to deal with it. So we have to give a forum for where it's safe for people of color to tell us their stories, because we're pretty ignorant about what they have gone through and what they experience in many cases every day. Let's do that. And then we'll begin to understand what the penance is later.
Thank you. And Bishop, you did a perfect advertisement for our next week a session of Theology on Tap, which is going to be facilitated by Darius Villalobos and Sister Mumbi Kigutha, on how to have difficult conversations and really listen to our sisters and brothers around race and privilege and justice issues. And we're going to be doing continued work. Timon Davis, a scholar from Loyola University out here, who does a lot of work in African American storytelling, is going to be doing a presentation for us later in the year on listening and storytelling. So we just want to encourage people to do exactly what the bishop said, which is to listen, learn, and then undertake a process of beginning to understand what's required of us. We're going to turn it over to Q&A. And so again, if anyone has questions they'd like to submit, you can submit them through the chat box. Our first question, we are going to unmute our friend Juan Carlos Cruz, who is going to ask it.
Thank you, Mike. I'm impressed at how you manage Zoom so well. So that's incredible. But Marisa, thank you for everything you do. I mean, it's amazing. I've read a little bit about your organization, and it's incredible what you do. And I hope many people support what you do. And Bishop Seitz, I wanted to ask you a question. First, thank you very much for what you do, for your witness, it's been a long time that I've wanted to follow a bishop, and you are someone that, really has shown such courage, such, I don't care if I'm going against what everybody is saying, and you do it, and you say, and Michael has read these amazing things from your pastoral letter, and your witness that we see in the news is just great. And I heard when Pope Francis called you to thank you for what you're doing, and it was pretty incredible. And so I wanted to ask you, Bishop, in a country that is so big, and I come from Chile, but we only have 33 bishops. I've lived in Philadelphia. I'm a U.S. citizen. I don't go through all the horror that so many other Hispanics have to go through. But I live in Philadelphia, and I'm amazed at the amount of bishops that you have in the U.S. And I don't intend, and I would never expect that they are all the same. But Bishop, to me and to many, you're an exception. And why are you an exception? And why not more people are like you? Why not more people stand up for things that are really wrong? Why so many stay quiet? Why do they take 8 days or 7 to put out a statement on George Floyd, and then and not to take us off topic because then the Supreme Court does something, has this historic ruling for gays and lesbians, and it takes 4 hours to put out a statement. And so to me, I don't want every bishop to be the same, but I also want more Bishop Seitz. And why is it that you are so unique, fortunately and unfortunately?
I think more Bishop Seitz would be a scary thing for the church. But
you know what I mean, like.
Yeah. I don't know. I've always been a type of person that kind of swims against the stream, and I think one of the reasons that I've been so visible is that I have the privilege of being the bishop of El Paso. We've just been at the heart of so many things. I think a lot of times my brother bishops aren't heard, I've heard of just wonderful things that so many bishops did in the aftermath, for instance, of George Floyd. They were out there demonstrating and so on. and I get very uncomfortable when I know that they're out there doing that, and yet people are out on social media saying, you know, Bishop, why don't other bishops do what you do, you know? So I think you also made the point, Juan Carlos, that yeah, you wouldn't want every bishop to be the same. The church is so big and the work is so broad, you know. Some are more focused on, you know, on fundamental questions of spirituality, of, you know, improving the health of their local church and so on. And you know, that's a need too. And that's the way they're responding to the Holy Spirit. So I know that I greatly respect the bishops that I've come to know in this country. They're outstanding people trying to live their faith.
Thank you.
It's a tough question, and so thank you for and thank you, Juan Carlos, who's become a friend of our community, for joining us. A question I had, because we haven't had another question come in. Question I had, Bishop, is that, you know, we're talking a lot right now about statues, monuments, symbols, and in your pastoral letter, you said that the wall is a sort of statue, a sort of a symbol of xenophobia, a physical symbol of xenophobia. So I guess what are some physical symbols Catholic churches might be able to erect of their own to communicate to the community that we are a community that, like, obviously that you said we started a Spanish Mass and people said, oh, well, no one's going to come. And then now they're coming. Are there any things that you think that Catholic communities can be doing to show that they want to be doing the work for racial justice?
Mm-hmm. You know, I've thought about that for a long time, especially in the light of the immigration issues in our country. And I see where the farther you get from the reality of life on the border, the more it is possible to, as Marisa said, other people, right? To make it seem like it's some foreign horde or something, you know. The farther you get from the realities, and somehow it seems to me we're not going to change the understanding in this country, and you know, the fear of immigrants crosses even political lines. We in our Catholic communities have to become places of encounter. You know, we have to become places where people truly meet people who are not just like them, you know. And we have to foster that. We have to encourage it. We have to celebrate it. If you don't have people from another culture in your parish, go get them. Invite them, bring them. I don't care if they're in your boundaries. Your church is impoverished by the fact that you don't have people from other cultures who speak other languages, can bring you a new insight into the beauty of this faith that's called Catholic universal, right? You know, bring them and celebrate them, celebrate their feasts. Have opportunities where people can talk to people, where you can hear their stories and so on. I've had this idea that on the immigration question, we need to bring immigrants into the midst of our communities and just hear their stories. I've seen amazing transformations, you know, when people just have that opportunity to get out of their ghetto, you know. There are white ghettos too, right? And come to know these people and hear their stories, understand why they fled their home and what their situation is now and what they're trying to do for their children. You know, it's transformative.
Thank you. And I can tell you that for our communities here in Chicago that are the products, the neighborhoods are the products of racially motivated segregation, and many of our parishes unfortunately suffer from those effects as well. That's a real clarion call for us to do that work of going outside our comfort zone in our neighborhoods. I want to go now to Barbara, who has a question about things like immersion trips for Marisa.
Thank you so much for both of you for being here. My question is related to the idea of encounter. We at St. Clement were planning an immersion experience to bring some folks out to El Paso earlier in the year, which was interrupted obviously by COVID-19. But I wonder what you think the role of those kinds of trips and those kinds of experiences are in this work for racial justice. A lot of folks think that, you know, an encounter of a short-term nature might reinforce power imbalance rather than help the work in the long term, to have folks come and witness what could be construed as exclusively an experience of suffering, and then to just extract themselves from that situation. So I wonder what you think that you know, physical encounter might look like, and what the value of sort of bringing outside folks into the community, or what problems that might bring as well.
Sure, thank you for that question. Encounter is incredibly important. I understand, especially from the critique of like a white savior kind of work, that can come across, or that it's more trauma porn, or some crass terms that get used when it comes to this kind of witness.
Yeah.
And the best programs that I've seen are those that require participants that it's less about the person you're encountering as an object of the encounter, but it's more about your own personal conversion. It's more about deepening the faith. And so whomever is crafting the experience, there's a really dramatic requirement to really think through a lot of the what I think is important is pre-reading, pre-analysis of assumptions, of expectations, of what can happen. When you're on the ground or in community, being very intentional about time for reflection and time for establishing kind of ground rules of how we will comport ourselves during this visit, what our purpose is for. While you may be taking, for example, resources to a migrant shelter, you might have a chance to engage with people that yes, it's about that moment and it's about that act of charity, but ultimately it's also the knowledge that a lot of times it can be by chance that people are in these unequal systems and unjust systems. And so really not it being about the person going to the encounter, kind of taking a back seat while you're in it to absorb it, allowing for time for reflection to really digest and experience, and then to really close the in-person experience wherever the encounter is with a beginning of how will this inform my work moving forward? How will this paint my faith? How will this change my actions? So that it's not that one time when I went to Matamoros and this is what I saw, but it's more about, wow, this profoundly shifted my worldview and how I look at policies regarding immigration. Or wow, this really shifted my perspective when it comes to children being kept in immigration detention and things like that. So I think it really comes down to the intentionality and being able to have people kind of not so much call each other out, but call each other in and make space for that reflection and participation. But I think encounter is something that's incredibly important. I know we learned so much when groups come to visit, groups like St. Clement's and others. It's profound. I know through my university experience, going on immersion trips was incredibly formative. And so if there is capacity to do that, I think all the better when we're back in a safe space where we can do that in a healthy way. We certainly invite folks to do that with the understanding that it requires that commitment to the before work, the during, and the after.
Thank you. And speaking of immersion experiences and the before work and the after, one of the people who came with us down to El Paso was Colleen McHugh, who is our parish's immigration coordinator now and has been being trained in remote data entry for asylees. And she has a question that she asked me to ask you, Marisa, which is, how many people are currently trapped in Mexico due to the Remain in Mexico policy, or do we have an estimate? And what would be the possibility of those people being processed potentially, or what would be the process by which they would be able to apply for asylum if it were a different administration?
Excellent question. So I don't have the latest numbers on exactly who is in Remain in Mexico currently in Ciudad Juarez, but I can certainly follow up and get that for you. I know the bishop was actually just recently in Juarez visiting with migrants through the Border Refugee Assistance Fund, another level of work that both he and partners with the Hope Border Institute have undertaken. It's so complicated. Immigration in this country has completely been gutted, and it's now a Franken policy of so many different parts that it's really going to take a comprehensive effort to look at everything holistically and try to recreate a vision of what immigration looks like for this country. So for people that are stuck and remain in Mexico, they're not even having court right now. The court has been closed. People are continuing to be getting shifting deadlines when it comes to when you have to go to the port to present yourself. Folks present themselves as early as 4 in the morning because you have to be there by 6 to be able to find out if you're going to court. Those dates have shifted throughout the pandemic, obviously, and so whole households are going, family units are going to the bridges at the dark hours of the morning where there are lots of nefarious actors at play, and it's very dangerous for people. We know that there are so many migrants that are living outside of the shelters, whereas before, you know, a shelter was a great place or a good place to be. Now with the pandemic, it's even more complicated. So for people, you know, in Remain in Mexico and for a change in administration, it would be, you know, a change to these policies. It would be kind of going back to how we were doing immigration before, which was releasing people in the US to sponsors. And so that would be more of a shorter term kind of solution, is to end that policy and allow people to go to their sponsors in places like Chicago. But realistically, we need a comprehensive overhaul of the system. And so as we go into the 2020 election, that's something that Hope is working on with international partners in different countries in Latin America, and especially in Central America, and thinking about root causes and what causes people, like the folks from Honduras that a bishop visited with, like what is causing people to leave? How is the US involved in that, directly, indirectly, through our corporations, through our policies, through our actions? And how do we, you know, be here and figure out a new solution for immigration, because what we're doing is certainly not working.
Thank you. Just to that point about learning and policies and how complicated it is, Marisa, when we were down in El Paso, Juarez, and we were at Annunciation House learning and listening to stories, one of the gentlemen that we met was a narcotics officer in Honduras, and all 4 members of his team had been assassinated by the cartels, and that still did not cause him to leave, but the cartel showed up on his door when his 12-year-old daughter was about to turn 13 and told him that on her 13th birthday they would take her. And so that's when he decided that he had no choice but to leave with her and his 10-year-old son. So when we heard these stories, and then we start thinking about drug cartels, narcotics trade, Chicago, all of these things being connected, and these systems of complicity and sinfulness, and how can we begin addressing, like you said, policies. I saw an article today from, I think, the New York Times that said 90% of the cocaine that's sold in the United States now goes through Guatemala, and how that has impacted the you know, migration there. All right, I'm going to go to our friend from Holy Name Cathedral who has a question for Bishop Ken.
Good evening. Bishop, I have a question for you, and it's an observation I've made in the last couple of weeks in light of the protest here in the United States. And I'm convinced that Generation Z is a vital and instrumental part of that. For some reason, Generation Z has been able to advocate for justice through protest. But at the same time, I've also noticed that the same generation does not seek any guidance from the church. my question to you would be, if given the opportunity, what would be at least 2 points that you would share with them in their journey for social justice?
Okay, that's a tough question. But I'll just list a couple of things that come to my mind. One is, it relates, you mentioned it in your question yourself, you know, don't presume that your understanding of justice is just something that you can intuit. These are very complex questions and issues, but it's more than just having an unreflective sense of what is fair. Justice is much deeper than that, and the justice of Jesus is something that transcends any human notion of justice. If we just try to do justice like the world does, we're not going to do well. We're going to harm people. That kind of justice is more like the kind of justice that says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and Jesus' justice is one that is filled with love and mercy. Don't try to, like they say in the advertisements, this was done by professionals. Don't try to do this at home. It's the same with finding a pathway towards justice. Yeah, the church has had its failings. Yes, the church has its blind spots, but you won't find another institution that has reflected on these questions for longer, or another institution that has the guidance of the Son of God. So that'd be one. The second is to take a really big view of what ultimately is our hope and our goal. If we think that somehow we're going to build a world that is completely just by our efforts, that somehow we're going to transform human beings from the broken reality that we are, then, and just build a kingdom here, we're going to be so disappointed. And what I see happening is people are disappointed and then they're angry because the world doesn't give them what their heart is longing for. The world is not going to fill those needs that are deepest within us. A lot of people in the world today, they think that if they just get enough material things, that they'll be happy. If they just get enough power, they'll be happy. And the world itself can become an idol like that. I mean, the quest for justice can be an idol if it's something that is a mere human creation. And so I would say, if you really want to find what a true hope for justice and fulfillment of the human person, you will find it only in God. Only in God. So those would be the two things that I just think are so important if we're going to transform the world. Got to maintain our hope, and hope isn't in just some human fulfillment. Hope is in a God who loves us so, and is the one fulfillment of our greatest longing.
Those are awesome points. And I wanted to just follow up quickly if I can, because I think it's a really profound question that we really have to wrestle with. I think it's tricky, again, due to the pandemic, but there's a way that I think the church can and ought to not miss out on the resource that is Gen Z, and to create space. So if that is, okay, you're going to be organizing a protest, a march, a rally, you need a place to meet at the parish hall. What would that look like? You know, there's ways that our churches, we know as to be the people, the vibrant space. And there's no reason why it cannot become a hub for these young folks. And there's ways to connect and do parish leadership specifically, thoughtfully, intentionally with youth in mind, led by youth. You know, we had the opportunity to host Jornada por la Justicia, a teach-in here in the Borderlands in October of this year. Oh my gosh. And we had folks, college students from across the country from Catholic universities come, and it was the first time a lot of them were actually doing any kind of activism or engagement in social justice topics through their faith. And it was amazing to see them on fire. So just like we have all of these charismatic traditions and the power of faith and retreats and all of these things, there's no reason why we can't engage youth and follow their lead in many ways, and not be limited by our own imaginations and be open up to new possibilities. So as much as it is the church can do for Gen Z, it's also that same kind of listening that Bishop was talking about that we can be doing and asking of them for their wisdom, because maybe they've clearly been given a gift that we need to heed and to follow.
Thank you. So a question from Valerie for Bishop Seitz is, how can we encourage our parish priests to address racism in preaching and parish communications? Yes, we're praying, but sometimes we hear, well, there isn't enough time in the homily, or it's too hard to address both sides. So how can lay Catholics encourage their priests to speak on this in the Mass or other ways that the church communicates?
Oh, that's a toughie. One thing I've observed about us priests is that the personality type that becomes a priest very often is a person who, you know, it's true of every human being, that we just want to be loved. You know, we don't want to hurt people's feelings, you know, and I think that keeps priests very often from taking on tough issues. And, you know, and also perhaps priests are a little bit confused because when you raise these issues of social justice, you're going to be immediately labeled according to through some political lens, according to some political ideology, you know, as okay, you know, and it's kind of funny, in the statements I've made before, I've both been called a member of the Democratic National Party and the Republican. So yeah, I'm just not sure where I fit, you know, and in a sense that's the point. But priests are scared of being labeled in that way, and the truth is, you know, if we're preaching the gospel, then we shouldn't be able to be labeled as such. But that's the accusation that's made. The best suggestion I can give you is get to know your priest, love your priest, encourage your priest. Know that, you know, if he says something that's the least bit challenging to his people, you know, tell him, thank you, Father. You know, we needed to hear that. You know, give them some positive feedback. I think that could help.
Thank you. Thanks for those tips. Vanessa has a question for Marisa.
Hi. So I had a question, and it's definitely been something that's kind of been on my mind recently. So I'm a Mexican American and definitely a very white passing and just benefit from a lot of privileges. Like I went to a lot of predominantly white schools, and then also my parents aren't immigrants. So the struggles at the border are something that I don't really have to think about on a daily basis. So I know that like I recognize a lot of those privileges for myself. So I was kind of curious if you had any advice for white Hispanics and just knowing how we fit in the picture, and just gaining momentum of like how we can continue to advocate for the issues at the border, and then just kind of any advice that you have for that.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question, Vanessa. You're so brave. That's tough stuff to just raise with a group. So kudos for that. So folks are aware when a person is, there's obviously a difference between ethnicity and race, right? So Latinos or Latinx people can be any race. We can be Afro-Latinx, we can be Asian Latinx, we can be all these different kinds of beautiful different backgrounds and different people, because the way that a particular portion of white supremacy goes towards this idea of colorism. And colorism is all about the color of skin. And the more white passing you are, kind of the higher up you are in the pecking order, and the darker you are, the closer to Black you are, or in a lot of times in Latinx culture, the more indigenous you look, the lower you are in the pecking order. And there's a lot of privileges that many of us have, right? Through no fault or just kind of happen that way, that we just need to walk through the world a little bit differently, or we get to see things from a different perspective. And so I, for one, even though I grew up in this border town, and my mom, ironically, was a Spanish teacher and my grandparents only spoke Spanish, I wasn't raised speaking Spanish. So I didn't learn Spanish, because when I was asked, like, I had a choice. I was given the option in elementary school, if you can imagine, of being in a gifted and talented program, which sounded really cool and different, or taking Spanish class. And it was like, no contest. I went to the gifted and talented program because it was more interesting. And so I somehow stopped learning Spanish, and my parents had put me in ballet classes, which, okay. And so then I was introduced to French. And so I started taking French classes in El Paso, Texas, because French is widely spoken here. And so it just boggles, it's kind of strange. But I have chosen to learn Spanish, and I majored in Spanish, and I spent time in Mexico, and I did those things because it was important to me. But sadly, there's so many ways that internalized racism plays out in our communities. And there's ways that you could feel less than, like you weren't Latinx enough if you didn't speak perfect Spanish, if you didn't grow up experiencing poverty, if you didn't grow up at the US-Mexico border, if you didn't go visit your relatives in another country, you know, things like that. There's sadly all these ways that we do that. And so recognizing that it's part of that system of oppression, part of our colonial history in particular of conquest and colonization, and part of our reality in the United States. So understanding that, that God has created us all uniquely and differently, and that's a beautiful thing, and embracing who we are fully with all of our imperfections and foibles, and then also using that, leveraging whatever privilege we have in service of others, whatever that may look like. For us at the Hope Border Institute, it's really for those that are the most oppressed and marginalized. The work is not only at the border. The work of justice is everywhere. It just happens to be our context. But part of our work in response to the pandemic has been really looking at how systems of inequality have been kind of drummed up and raised through the COVID response. And so what does it look like when people of color are frontline workers, or when they are considered essential, when maybe it's more like they're disposable? What does it look like when we have eviction moratoriums, and how does that help people? What happens to people who weren't supported through stimulus options, through through stimulus packages because they're married to someone who's undocumented, they're undocumented, or they're in a mixed status household. So there are things where the border and a lot of these issues are right there in your backyard, and they're in your community, and they're part of who we are and what we're about. And so it's important to recognize that the work of justice can, and an anti-racist focus can take so much variety in the context that we live in. As far as border specific and immigration related work, again, you can be doing that in Chicago. I know there's some groups that do accompaniment. I'm not sure what that's looking like in a pandemic world, but it looks like making sure that people, when they go to the immigration court hearings, have someone kind of on their side. Migrants and asylum seekers are often alone in this country and don't really have anybody with them. So much like a prison ministry where you would go and be in solidarity or in prayer with someone, the same can be done with people either in immigration detention or people who are outside of the detention system but are going to court. And there's ways that you can learn. Our website, hopeborder.org, is chock full of resources. We make it part of our work to make sure that the research that we do isn't kept to us, but it's really shareable. All of the content that we create is designed to belong to the church and to the people of faith. So if there's ever anything that we can help point you to in that regard, we're happy to do that. But you're doing good work just by recognizing some of these challenges, and know that you're clearly not alone in this. We're all figuring our way out through it and holding out the possibility of what a world would look like without some of these challenges.
Thank you. We did have several more questions come in, but we've got time for one more. And so I'm going to go to Tara for a final question to both of our speakers.
Yes, hi. And this goes along with what you were just saying, Marisa, too, about resources. But like Bishop Seitz was saying earlier about how important it is for us right now to listen to the voices that have been historically silenced and oppressed, and just coming into a deeper understanding of what that means, since many of us are coming from like a privileged background, and then taking that information too and engaging in conversations with people who are in our communities, and making sure that this is a conversation on a broad spectrum. Do you have any recommendations from like spiritual resources from the church or outside of that that you would recommend in trying to learn from, and then helping us as we engage in these conversations with others?
Is that a question to me?
I think both.
Yeah, the gospel.
Classic.
It's kind of funny, but sometimes we presume it. We almost leapfrog the gospel, you know. But that's an awesome place to start, and to look at how Jesus deals with people who were made other in his society, right? You know, the Samaritan woman, the widow in Tyre, you know, that conversation, the story about that he tells about the so-called good Samaritan, to understand how radical it was to talk about a Samaritan as possibly being good, you know. So the gospel there, of course, Paul's letters and St. John, Paul, his letter to Philemon is radical, you know, radical, talking about this slave that had run away, you know, and you know, sending him back to his master, not as a slave, but as a brother. You know, be steeped in the scriptures, in the gospel, to begin with. In terms of other writings, I'd have to give it a little more thought, but one that is just so pointed and relatively brief, Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail is just amazing and steeped in Catholic social teaching, you know. That are a couple of things that come to my mind. Marisa?
Yeah, I would just offer, a little plug for Milton Bravo, who's on the call, and Commonweal. They did an amazing podcast with Father Brian Massengale. And so there's some amazing work and also that's being done. And also I would point you in the direction. A lot of universities have also started doing these Zoom calls or webinars. And so I know Georgetown University did one recently. I'm sure that Michael can point that out to folks. Really great analysis on what's happening within the church. And then I know Faith and Public Life also did a conversation with Olga Segura and Father Massengale again. And I literally took down notes of all these different Catholic faith leaders and theologians who are doing this work. So the work is never done. It's constant learning and constant growing. And so those are just some resources that we're looking to right now, in addition to kind of what's being done in our own backyard here with Bishop Seitz.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard of these great pastoral letters. I don't know if they're any good, but you might.
Absolutely. In fact, all of the things that were just mentioned are included in our Catholic anti-racism resource guide with Bishop Seitz and Pope John Paul on the front, and then it's linked by pastoral statements from here in Chicago, from around the country, with articles, resources for family. And so, in fact, all of the things that were just mentioned, including the Georgetown University event recently with Archbishop Gregory and with Olga Segura and Brian Massengale, all of those are included as our books by Catholic theologians. So we have that actually available as a Google document, and we encourage people, not just our Clement parishioners, but anyone that you know who is looking for reading lists. There are TED Talks, there are family resources, so we really encourage people to check that out.
That's amazing, by the way. Like, kudos for curating that and putting that together. That's an amazing resource.
We want one of the things for anyone watching is we want our parish and our citywide church's commitment to anti-racism, not just to be a summer speaker series or to be a cause of the moment. We want to commit our communities to doing the long-term work, and a lot of that requires educating ourselves. And so when we talk to our theologian friends like Father Brian Massengale, he says, I wrote the book 10 years ago. Read the book, then we'll talk, So we're really encouraging people to read some Shannon D. Williams at Villanova, who's been chronicling the contributions of Black religious sisters. So there's a lot of great stuff in there. I want to thank both of our speakers for coming tonight. This was really a privilege to have you share with our community and lead us in this conversation. Want to encourage people to think about joining us next Tuesday night. Anyone who joined us, not just here in Chicago, you're all welcome to join us for, now that we've established tonight that the work for racial justice is the work of the church. It's not an add-on, it's not an additional feature, it's not the premium plan, it's the basic included with all models plan. The next step is, how do we begin listening to each other's stories? How do we begin having these uncomfortable conversations? And how will we prepare ourselves to come away perhaps a little bit humbled, but committed to this work? So thank you to our guests tonight. Any final thoughts from either of you?
Oh, I've really enjoyed it, and I really appreciate your commitment to spending some of your time doing this. You're making the pandemic into a time of real possibilities and growth, and I'm grateful for that. I'll just mention, if your heart was moved, as Marisa described the situation of those who are stuck right now in the second most dangerous city in the world, Ciudad Juarez, our Border Refugee Assistance Fund would be a way you can directly help them. We're not allowing a border to be the demarcation point for our love and compassion. Thank you.
Amen to that. Thank you all so much for allowing us to have some space with you. Thank you for being open, and we'll pray for continued growth and for the bright future for our church.
Thank you everyone for participating. We hope to see you for the rest of our series. Like I said, next week we're doing how to have difficult conversations around race, privilege, and justice. Week 3, we're joined by historian Matthew Kressler, who wrote a book called Authentically Black and Truly Catholic, who will be helping us explore some of the myths of American identity and the whole question of, well, my Irish great-grandparents didn't own slaves, so what you know, how can I be complicit in this? And our final speaker for Theology on Tap is Sister Anita Baird, who was the founding director of the Archdiocese of Chicago's Office for Racial Justice and has been involved in the work of anti-racism training for many years. So thank you again, and we hope to see many of you next week.